Friends, comrades, and fellow Americans, let me begin with a blunt truth. Trump is in far deeper trouble than I anticipated. And the reason may not be what the media or the political establishment would have you believe. They want to make this about courtroom drama, about the endless swirl of indictments, about the latest headline that flashes across your screen. But beneath that surface spectacle lies something far more profound, the unraveling of an economic and political system that Trump both exploited and now finds himself crushed beneath. Let me be clear. Trump didn't create the mess we are in. He was a symptom of it. He was the product of 40 years of rising inequality, of jobs outsourced, wages stagnated, and communities gutted. He gave voice, in his own distorted, often ugly way, to the deep anger of millions who've been betrayed by both parties. But here's the hook, and I want you to hold on to it. The very same conditions that propelled him upward are now accelerating his downfall. The promises he made of restoring jobs, of protecting the working class, of standing up to elites, have collided head-on with the realities of an economy that is cracking under its own contradictions. Consider the numbers: debt at historic highs, housing increasingly out of reach for ordinary families, corporations making record profits while ordinary people work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Trump told people he would fix this. He told them he would make America great again. But his policies, whether tax cuts for the rich or deregulation for corporations, only deepened the very crises he claimed to solve. And now, as those crises intensify, even his base begins to feel the sting of betrayal. That's trouble number one. Trouble number two is political. Trump's strategy relied on being the outsider, the disruptor, the man who could drain the swamp. But after years in power and years of legal battles, the image no longer holds. You cannot claim to be the champion of working people while living as the embodiment of elite privilege. You cannot posture as the savior of democracy while actively undermining it. His contradictions are catching up with him, and they are sharper, deeper, and more visible than ever before. And then there is trouble number three, history itself. Every empire in decline produces figures like Trump, loud, charismatic, divisive. But history teaches us something else as well. Such figures rarely survive the crises that created them. They are consumed by them. Trump is in far deeper trouble because the system itself is in far deeper trouble. The collapse of trust in institutions, the economic squeeze on families, the rise of social unrest, these are forces far larger than him, and no amount of rallies, slogans, or court maneuvers can hold them back. When we talk about Donald Trump's troubles today, the conversation often gets swallowed up by the spectacle of his legal battles, the indictments, the court appearances, the back and forth over whether he will be barred from office. All of this dominates headlines. But here's the hook. That drama is just the tip of the iceberg. The real story, the one that should worry Trump far more, is not the courtroom itself, but the broader ground beneath his feet that is cracking. If we mistake the noise of trials for the substance of his downfall, we miss the deeper forces closing in on him. Think of it this way: a legal crisis can damage a politician, but only when the political and economic environment no longer shields him. Richard Nixon survived scandal after scandal until the broader climate turned against him. Then the walls caved in quickly. Trump faces a similar dynamic. The courts alone cannot end his career, but combined with the collapse of his political narrative and the disillusionment of his supporters, they expose vulnerabilities far more serious than a jury's verdict. His trouble is not simply a legal matter, it is structural. Why? Because Trump built his political persona on the claim that he was an outsider, a man strong enough to push back against elites and deep state institutions. For years, that posture gave him cover. Every indictment became proof to his supporters that the system feared him. But here's the catch. When those same supporters begin to feel the weight of economic hardship, when their wages no longer cover rent or groceries, when their children cannot afford college or health care, the shield begins to weaken. At some point, the endless legal drama shifts from proof of his courage to evidence of chaos. The courtroom spectacle begins to look less like resistance and more like incompetence, distraction, and decline. This is where Trump's deeper trouble lies. His base was willing to forgive scandal after scandal so long as they believed he could deliver. But the United States today is not delivering for them, and he has no convincing answers. Inflation erodes paychecks, housing remains out of reach, medical debt crushes families, and the jobs that exist pay too little to sustain dignity. Trump promised to reverse all of this. Instead, during his time in office, his policies enriched the wealthy, widened inequality, and left working Americans even more vulnerable. Now, when those same Americans look at his legal troubles, they see not a warrior standing up for them, but a wealthy man fighting for his own survival while their struggles deepen. That shift in perception is powerful. Political figures fall not simply because of what they do wrong, but because the public no longer finds them useful in navigating crises. Trump's endless legal battles might once have energized his supporters. Today, they risk exhausting them. Every new charge, every televised courtroom drama reinforces the sense that he is bogged down, trapped in a personal fight that has little to do with the urgent problems facing ordinary people. That gap between his image and their reality is widening, and it is in that widening space where real political trouble grows. There is also a historical irony here. Trump styled himself as the great deal maker, the man who could bend systems to his will. Yet what is unfolding now reveals the opposite. He is a man increasingly bent by systems he cannot control. The courts, the media, the economic forces, they are no longer props in his performance. They are now the actors, pushing the story forward, often against his will. For a figure who built his entire brand on control and dominance, that reversal is devastating. And here is the sharp hook. Nothing punctures the myth of strength faster than the image of a man caught in a storm he cannot master. So when we say Trump is in far deeper trouble than anticipated, we must look past the courtroom stage. The real trouble is that the trials are symbols of a broader unraveling, the outsider image that no longer convinces, the promises that no longer persuade, and the supporters who no longer feel protected. Legal drama can be survived, systemic disillusionment cannot. Trump is learning day by day that his greatest threat is not the judge's gavel, but the loss of the political and economic ground that once held him up. Donald Trump rose to political power by promising ordinary Americans that he would deliver what decades of politicians had failed to provide: secure jobs, decent wages, and a pathway back to stability for working families. He tapped into a reservoir of anger that had been building for 40 years, an anger fueled by deindustrialization, factory closures, jobs outsourced overseas, and communities left to wither under the pressures of globalization. He told those people he would be their champion. He told them he would bring back manufacturing, tear up bad trade deals, and put the working class first. That was the hook that electrified his campaign, the billionaire who claimed to stand with the forgotten worker. But here is where the deeper trouble begins, because those promises did not hold. They collapsed. and with them, the very foundation of his political appeal is cracking. During his presidency, Trump's actual economic record diverged sharply from his rhetoric. Instead of lifting working families, his policies disproportionately favored the wealthy and the corporations that already dominated the economy. His signature legislative achievement, the 2017 tax cut, was sold as a boon for the middle class. He claimed it would unleash investment, create jobs, and raise wages. What actually happened was predictable to anyone who understands capitalism. Corporations used the windfall for stock buybacks, enriching executives and shareholders, while wages for ordinary workers barely moved. The wealthy saw their fortunes grow, while working class households saw little to none of the promised prosperity. That broken promise is now haunting him, because it is difficult to claim the mantle of working class defender when your policies left workers still gasping for air. Let's look closer at the trade issue. Trump hammered away at NAFTA and other trade agreements, telling steel workers, auto workers, and coal miners that he would revive their industries. Yet despite his tariffs and renegotiations, the larger trends of automation, outsourcing, and global supply chains marched on. Jobs continued to vanish. Wages remained stagnant. Communities dependent on manufacturing continued to erode. The promise of a restored industrial heartland never materialized. The reality was that tariffs raised costs for consumers, squeezed small businesses, and barely touched the deeper structural forces hollowing out American industry. And here's the painful hook. When people feel the gap between what they were promised and what they actually live, the disappointment cuts deeper than if nothing had been promised at all. Trump also played heavily on the image of protecting American workers from immigrant labor, suggesting that closing the border would safeguard jobs. Yet the problems facing workers were never about immigrants, they were about corporate strategies to minimize costs and maximize profits. Even with stricter immigration policies, employers continued to suppress wages, outsource production, and exploit workers in every way possible. Trump's scapegoating distracted from these systemic realities, but it did not change them. And today, more and more workers are realizing that the enemy was not their neighbor from another country, but the corporations that profited from their exploitation. Now, combine these failures with the current economic reality. Housing prices and rents are at historic highs. Healthcare costs remain a crushing burden. Student debt traps young people before their adult lives even begin. Inflation has eroded paychecks, and multiple job holding is increasingly the norm. The people who once put their hopes in Trump are not just disappointed, they are living the daily grind of broken promises. And the courts, the rallies, the slogans, none of them pay the bills. None of them keep the lights on. The myth that he could deliver where others failed is unraveling because lived experience contradicts the story. The danger for Trump is not that his base will suddenly embrace his opponents, but rather that the faith that once sustained him is eroding. Political power built on promises is fragile. Once those promises are exposed as illusions, loyalty wanes. Trump's enemies may never win over his supporters, but his supporters may quietly withdraw, grow disillusioned, and stop showing up with the same fervor. This erosion is subtle but powerful. It is what makes his troubles far deeper than any indictment or headline. His greatest asset, the belief that he was different from other politicians, is precisely what his broken promises have destroyed. The hook then is this. Trump is not simply facing opposition from the courts, the Democrats, or the so-called deep state. He is facing opposition from reality itself. And reality is relentless. It shows up in the rent check, the grocery bill, the empty factory lot. It shows up in the child who cannot afford health care or the parent who cannot afford retirement. These are the places where promises collide with truth. And once that truth settles in, the politician who built his brand on economic salvation becomes just another figure in the long history of false prophets. Donald Trump's political identity was forged around a powerful narrative. He was not like the others. He was the outsider, the disruptor, the man who had come to Washington to drain the swamp and break the stranglehold of a corrupt elite. That image was not just rhetoric, it was his armor. It protected him from scandals that would have sunk other politicians. It allowed his supporters to dismiss criticism as attacks from a threatened establishment. It transformed every investigation into proof of his authenticity. But here is the hook. The outsider image that once shielded him is crumbling. And as it crumbles, the core of his appeal erodes with it. When Trump first entered politics, his wealth and brash persona made him seem untouchable, someone who could say what he wanted because he was not dependent on donors or party bosses. Many Americans admired that independence, contrasting it with politicians who seemed owned by corporations and lobbies. But over time, Trump's actions in office and beyond revealed a contradiction that grows sharper with every passing year. Far from standing apart from the elite, he governed in ways that enriched them. His cabinet was stacked with billionaires, corporate executives, and insiders. His policies favored the wealthy through tax cuts and deregulation. The swamp was not drained, it was repopulated with his own appointees. The claim of outsider status begins to look hollow when the supposed outsider sits comfortably at the center of the very elite system he claimed to oppose. This contradiction now haunts him. The public can tolerate many things in a leader, but hypocrisy is poison. Trump told struggling workers that he alone understood their plight, yet he lived as a symbol of excess. Golf courses, luxury towers, private jets. His image as a man of the people was always precarious, but in the beginning, it felt fresh enough to be believable. After years of watching his policies benefit the wealthy, while their own lives grew harder, more and more of his supporters see through the illusion. And here lies the sharper hook. Once the mask of outsider status slips, the man behind it looks not heroic but ordinary, just another politician promising change and delivering more of the same. The legal troubles he now faces only deepen this unraveling. At first, indictments reinforced his claim to be a victim of a corrupt establishment. But repetition changes perception. When the same headlines appear month after month, scandal after scandal, fatigue sets in. What once seemed like proof of his courage begins to look like proof of his entanglement in the very system he vowed to dismantle. Instead of appearing above the fray, he now looks consumed by it. His brand was built on strength, independence, and control. Today, the spectacle of endless courtroom battles projects weakness, dependence, and vulnerability. The outsider narrative also falters in another crucial way. Outsiders are expected to deliver disruption, to change the rules of the game. But after years in power, what lasting transformation can Trump point to? Inequality widened, corporate power expanded, and the political establishment remains as entrenched as ever. For all his fiery language, the system he promised to break remains intact. To his most loyal supporters, that failure can be rationalized, but to many others, it exposes him as less disruptor and more performer. Someone who talked loudly but left the same structures in place. The hook here is devastating. When the disruptor becomes indistinguishable from the disrupted system, his entire brand collapses. This erosion of the outsider image matters because it was always the glue holding together a coalition that otherwise made little sense. Evangelicals, blue-collar workers, suburban business owners, and anti-government libertarians had little in common except their shared faith that Trump was different. Once that difference evaporates, the coalition weakens. Some supporters drift into disillusionment, some retreat into silence, and some look for new voices to carry the outsider mantle. Trump may keep a loyal base, but without the magnetic pull of authenticity, that base risks shrinking into a hardened minority rather than a broad movement. In politics, perception is everything. A man who once looked untamed now looks entangled. A figure once celebrated for shaking up the system now seems trapped by it. And the most dangerous perception of all is that he has become what he once promised to fight. That shift, subtle but profound, explains why Trump's troubles are far deeper than legal charges alone. The outsider myth, once his greatest strength, is unraveling. And when the myth unravels, so does the man who depended on it. The United States today is gripped by an economic crisis that touches nearly every family, and it is within this crisis that Donald Trump's deeper troubles are exposed. The headlines may focus on indictments or rallies, but ordinary Americans are living through something far more immediate and painful, a cost of living spiral that feels unrelenting. Housing is increasingly out of reach for millions. Wages lag behind inflation. Healthcare remains a crushing burden, and corporate profits continue to soar while families juggle multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Here is the hook. When a politician builds his power on the promise of fixing these problems and instead presides over their worsening, his political armor begins to crack. No courtroom spectacle can disguise the lived reality of economic betrayal. Trump's campaign rhetoric was filled with assurances that he would restore prosperity, that he would make America a place where working families could once again thrive. Yet the record of his years in office, combined with the ongoing trajectory of the economy, tells a very different story. Take housing. For decades, affordable housing has slipped further out of reach. But in the years since Trump's presidency, the crisis has accelerated. Home ownership, once a cornerstone of the American dream, is now unattainable for vast segments of the population. Rent consumes an ever larger share of income, leaving families in constant precarity. Trump promised to bring stability, but the very market forces his administration empowered have fueled speculation, corporate landlordship, and price hikes that make stability impossible. Then consider wages. For ordinary workers, real wages have barely moved in decades. Trump declared that under his leadership, workers would see dramatic improvement, yet the reality was modest increases at best, often erased by inflation and rising costs of living. His tax cuts overwhelmingly benefited corporations and the wealthy, who in turn funneled the gains into stock buybacks rather than wage growth. Workers looked for relief, but instead watched the gap between themselves and the top grow wider. And the hook here is unmistakable. Promises of prosperity ring hollow when paychecks don't cover the basics, when the rich grow richer while workers feel squeezed harder than ever. Healthcare is another arena where the contradiction is glaring. Trump vowed to replace the Affordable Care Act with something better, something cheaper, something fairer, but no such plan ever materialized. Instead, healthcare costs continued their relentless climb. Families still ration insulin, still drown in medical debt, still face the terror of a single illness wiping out their savings. For working class supporters who believe Trump would take on this crisis, the disappointment has hardened into frustration. Legal drama does not distract from a medical bill in the mailbox. At the same time, corporate America has flourished. During Trump's presidency and after, corporate profits have reached staggering heights. The largest companies have extracted more from workers while giving back less. Shareholders have seen unprecedented returns, while employees struggle with unstable schedules and inadequate benefits. The image of Trump as a champion of the working man grows weaker each time another report shows record-breaking corporate profits alongside stagnant wages. The contradiction between his rhetoric and the lived reality of capitalism under his watch is not theoretical. It is visible in every household budget stretched to the breaking point. This economic crisis is not just background noise to Trump's political fate, it is the central stage. When people feel economically secure, they can overlook scandals, they can forgive rhetoric, they can even tolerate chaos. But when economic insecurity dominates daily life, patience evaporates. Trump's problem is that the very people who once placed their hopes in him now feel no better off, and in many cases worse off than before. The courtroom battles that once energized them begin to look irrelevant when compared to the battle of paying rent, affording groceries, or keeping a roof overhead. And here is the devastating hook. Trump's brand depended on being the man who could fix what others would not. He told Americans he alone could restore greatness. He alone could bring back prosperity. Yet today, as the crisis deepens, his image as savior is colliding head-on with the reality of failure. The economy exposes every false promise, every illusion, every policy that enriched the few at the expense of the many. And once economic reality breaks the spell, no amount of slogans can put it back together. History has a way of repeating itself, especially in societies grappling with decline, and Donald Trump now finds himself caught in a pattern far older than his own career. When empires weaken, when economies falter, and when faith in institutions collapses, figures like Trump almost always emerge. They are loud, charismatic, divisive leaders who promise to restore greatness, who claim to embody the will of the people against a corrupt elite. They thrive in moments of uncertainty, drawing strength from chaos. But here is the hook. History shows us that these figures rarely outlast the very crises that brought them to power. They rise on the storm, but sooner or later the storm consumes them. Trump is facing precisely this historical trap. Consider the Roman Republic at its end, when economic inequality, political corruption, and social unrest produced strongmen like Caesar, who promised to cut through the gridlock of a failing system. Or look at 20th century Europe, where economic depression and political instability gave rise to leaders who claimed only they could restore order and pride. In every case, these leaders became symbols of resistance to decline, yet their personal fortunes were tied to crises that never truly abated. Once the promises they made collided with the stubborn realities of systemic breakdown, their aura of invincibility faded, often catastrophically. Trump now mirrors this trajectory, a man elevated by collapse, now weighed down by its unrelenting persistence. Trump's rise was inseparable from decades of economic decline in the United States. The loss of stable jobs, the outsourcing of industries, the hollowing out of communities, and the erosion of trust in political institutions created the fertile ground for his appeal. He did not invent these problems, but he positioned himself as the answer to them. That strategy can work in the short term, but history teaches us that unless the underlying crises are resolved, the leader who embodies the solution eventually becomes identified with the failure to solve them. And here lies the sharp hook. The very conditions that lifted Trump up are now dragging him down because the crisis persists, and his inability to end it reveals his weakness rather than his strength. There is also the matter of time. Historical figures who ride waves of anger and desperation must constantly prove their effectiveness. Their appeal depends on the perception of momentum. But when momentum stalls, when promises remain unfulfilled, disillusionment grows quickly. Trump has had nearly a decade to prove he could reverse America's decline. Instead, the economy remains fragile, inequality deepens, and institutions remain mired in dysfunction. The outsider who once looked like a wrecking ball against the establishment now looks increasingly like another casualty of history's cycle. Another lesson from history is that declining empires often turn their leaders into scapegoats. When people feel betrayed, when the promises of renewal fall flat, the leader who once carried their hopes becomes the figure blamed for their pain. Trump's legal battles and endless controversies make him an easy target for this process. What once made him appear heroic, standing alone against the establishment, now risks making him appear responsible for the chaos. In times of decline, the crowd quickly shifts from adoration to condemnation. That pivot is as old as history itself, and Trump is not immune to it. And then there is the symbolic dimension. Trump fashioned himself into a myth, the only man who could restore greatness, the lone warrior for the forgotten people. But history is unkind to myths built on fragile ground. Once reality punctures the myth, once people see that greatness has not returned, that jobs have not reappeared, that life feels harder, not easier, the myth collapses under its own weight. And when a myth collapses, it collapses quickly. This is why history suggests that Trump is in deeper trouble than many realize. His survival depends on sustaining a story that reality is steadily dismantling. The hook is simple yet profound. History does not forgive leaders who fail to deliver in times of decline. It exposes them, strips them of their aura, and leaves them vulnerable to the very forces they once seemed to command. Trump, like so many before him, may discover that the storm that lifted him is stronger than his ability to control it. In the grand arc of history, figures like him often burn brightly, dominate the stage for a moment, and then fade, consumed by the very crises that made them possible. That pattern is repeating itself now, and Trump is learning the hard lesson that history spares no one. Donald Trump's personal fate cannot be separated from the fate of the system that produced him, because the two are intertwined in ways many commentators miss. His rise was not an accident, nor was it simply the triumph of a skilled demagogue. It was the logical outcome of decades of mounting inequality, corporate dominance, political paralysis, and disillusionment with the promises of American capitalism. He became a vessel for anger, a lightning rod for frustration, and an outlet for resentment toward elites. But here is the hook. When the system itself is failing, the downfall of one man does not end the crisis. In fact, his troubles mirror the system's troubles, and unless the root causes are addressed, America will continue producing new Trumps again and again, each potentially more dangerous than the last. To understand this dynamic, it is crucial to see Trump not as an anomaly, but as a symptom. For 40 years, wages for the majority of workers have stagnated while productivity soared. The wealth generated went overwhelmingly to the top, concentrating power and privilege in the hands of a few. Meanwhile, basic needs, healthcare, housing, education, became increasingly expensive, pushing families into debt and insecurity. Both political parties presided over this trajectory, and neither reversed it. This steady erosion of economic security created a void in American politics. Trump stepped into that void, promising to give voice to the forgotten, but the void remains, and his inability to fill it has revealed just how deep the structural rot goes. What makes Trump's troubles more profound is that his failures expose the bankruptcy of the system itself. His tax policies did not deliver broad-based prosperity, they reinforced inequality. His trade wars did not restore jobs, they disrupted markets while the larger forces of globalization and automation marched on. His promises to protect American workers collided with the reality of a corporate system that prioritizes profit above all else. And here lies the sharp hook. Trump's personal collapse is a reflection of capitalism's broader failure to meet the needs of its people. When his supporters look around and see no improvement in their lives, they are not only losing faith in him, they are losing faith in the system he claimed to master. This is where the danger intensifies, because when disillusionment deepens but no structural change occurs, anger does not disappear, it shifts. Today it may be Trump's decline that captures headlines, but tomorrow it could be another figure channeling the same resentment, perhaps with greater discipline, perhaps with fewer legal entanglements, perhaps with even more authoritarian impulses. The cycle is self-perpetuating because the system keeps producing the very conditions that make such figures appealing. Unless those conditions, inequality, insecurity, alienation, are addressed, the politics of resentment will find new champions. Trump is not the end of something. He is a sign of what lies ahead if the system itself is left untouched. That is why focusing solely on Trump's personal, legal, or political troubles misses the larger picture. The real story is not just the man on trial, but the millions of people who feel abandoned, betrayed, and desperate. They turn to Trump once, and while some may turn away in disappointment, others will look for a replacement who promises even more forcefully to tear down the establishment. The hook is unsettling, but undeniable. The fall of Trump may not weaken the populist wave, but strengthen it if people conclude that the system is still broken and no one has fixed it. Trump's personal troubles, then, are a mirror held up to American capitalism, the distrust of institutions, the anger at elites, the sense of powerlessness among ordinary people. These are not accidents. They are the predictable consequences of an economic order that prioritizes wealth over well-being. Trump did not cause this reality. He exploited it. But now, as he struggles under the weight of scandals, indictments, and failures, his troubles illuminate just how fragile and unstable the system has become. And if history is any guide, ignoring the systemic nature of the problem only ensures that new leaders will emerge from the wreckage, each claiming to be the savior, each feeding on the anger the system continues to generate. The hook to remember is simple but sobering. Trump's fate is not just his own, it is tied to the fate of a system in crisis. And unless that system is fundamentally changed, America will not be done with Trumpism, even if it is done with Trump. His downfall is not an end. It is a warning of what is still to come. Let me conclude with this. Trump's troubles are real, and they are deep, but they are not just his own. They are the troubles of a system that has been unraveling for decades, a system that enriches the few while leaving the many behind, a system that produces inequality, insecurity, and despair on a scale that no leader, no matter how loud, can hide forever. His rise was made possible by these failures, and his downfall is now being accelerated by them. We should not fool ourselves into thinking that once Trump is gone, the problems vanish with him. Unless we confront the root causes, the structures of an economy that serves profit before people, we will see new figures step into his place, new versions of the same politics of resentment. The real lesson is not about one man, but about the conditions that made him possible. Trump's story, in the end, is a mirror, reflecting back the failures of American capitalism itself. The question is not whether he survives or falls. The question is whether we are ready to face what his rise and his troubles reveal about the system we live in.